I'm Erica Piola, Director of the Visual Culture Program, and I'm delighted to be the host of this evening's Fireside Chat with former Library Company Fellow Dr. Jamie L. Brummitt. In her talk tonight, Jamie will be discussing her new book, Protestant Relics in Early America, which explores the relationships among material culture, mourning, and gender in early America, and deconstructs the historical assumption that mourning is a feminine practice while also shedding light on the role of relics in Protestantism. But before we begin, I would like to note that the chat is about 40 minutes and there will be time for questions and answers. So please place any queries in the Q&A button on the bottom of the screen at any time during the program. I would also like to briefly introduce the Library Company and the Visual Culture Program to those who may not be familiar with either. The Library Company was originally started in 1731 as a subscription library by then printer Benjamin Franklin and his discussion group, the Junto. Today, we are an independent research library for the study of American culture and history before the early 20th century. Our rich holdings include over 1 million books, graphics, ephemera, and art artifacts, and comprise subject strengths such as African American history, women's history, and visual culture. The latter inspired the implementation of the Visual Culture Program with the mission to promote visual literacy through the creative use of historical visual materials, and supports exhibitions, publications, acquisitions, digital projects, public programs, and research fellowships. The latter's deadline forthcoming on January 15th. Please see the chat and the program's website for more details if you are interested. The Visual Culture Program also seeks to facilitate talks such as today's that confront, explore, and complicate the social construction of what we see, how we see it, and why we see it as we do in our understanding of the mass visual culture of the nation before 1950. This evening, I am delighted to host Jamie in her talk about her most recent published work that explores Protestant relics as not only material, but also visual objects, and provides a meticulous historiography of how American Protestants came to ideologically and practically see and sense relics as supernatural memory objects with agency. Jamie examines the art of mourning in both senses of the word and includes in her study discussions of postmortem portraits into the age of photography, the iconography and role of antebellum era embroideries in young women's education, and illustrations of the image of the good death in early 19th century evangelical children's memoirs. I suspect we might hear about a few of these topics tonight. It is now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Jamie L. Brummitt. Jamie is an associate professor of American religions and material culture at the University of North Carolina, Wilmington. Jamie earned her PhD from Duke University, and in 2017, Jamie was the recipient of the Anthony N.B. and Beatrice W.B. Garvin Research Fellowship in American Material Culture at the Library Company of Philadelphia. She's also a past fellow of the George Washington Presidential Library at Mount Vernon, Winterthur Museum Garden and Library, the Filson Historical Society, and the New England Regional Fellowship Consortium. As we will hear more tonight, her book Protestant Relics in Early America examines relic veneration, corpse inspection, and the art of mourning in the early United States. Jamie, thank you so much again for joining us this evening, and the screen is now yours.
Good evening. Thank you, Erica. And thank you all for being here. I'm honored to be here for this fireside chat. I'm going to share research from my new book, Protestant Relics in Early America. If you're interested in purchasing the book, I'm sharing a 30% off discount code that can be used at Oxford University Press's website. We will also share this code and the link in the chat. This book argues that Protestants in late colonial America and the early American Republic collected relics of their dead and used relics to experience the supernatural presences of their dead. Gathering, preserving, speaking to, touching, and circulating relics served as important Protestant devotional practices. But these practices surrounding relics also structured systems of power among the living in areas such as national politics and education policy, as well as practices of American citizenship, religious freedom, and slavery. I situate Protestant relic practices within Protestant mourning traditions. Early American Protestants were a mourning people. Mourning practices were considered material expressions of devotion to God. Protestants mourned by gathering around deathbeds in hopes of witnessing the peaceful deaths of loved ones, which they argued confirmed people's salvation and afterlives in heaven. They inspected corpses or bodily relics for supernatural signs of salvation. They cut locks of hair from dead bodies to keep as relics. They visited corpses buried in graveyards to weep and to re experience souls. They also commissioned and collected other relics, such as images of corpses, coffin fragments, and other objects that had belonged to the dead. Early American Protestants considered relics to be lively memory objects of dead family members, friends, and leaders that connected them physically to souls of the dead. As lively memory objects, Protestants touched and looked at relics to bring the dead back to life in other material forms so they could feel the presences of the dead in heaven. These Protestant relic practices were embedded within Enlightenment frameworks, which defined memory objects as lively objects. Some of the most striking examples of lively memory objects appeared in the ways late 18th century people employed images and locks of hair to remember their living friends. These objects carried important sensory information about friends, which helped enliven memories of them and make them really present. The Library Company of Philadelphia has a fantastic example of this in its collections. It is a snuff box with a portrait of Benjamin Franklin. In May 1799, Georgiana Shipley, the daughter of an Anglican bishop, wrote to Benjamin Franklin and requested that he send her something by which to remember him. About a decade earlier, Franklin visited the Shipley family in England while working on his autobiography, and the two became friends. Since then, Shipley had seen images of Franklin, but none that looked like him. She explained the problem and requested that Franklin send her a good likeness with a lock of his hair. She wrote, quote, "Numberless are the prints and medals we have seen of you, but none that I quite approve. Should you have a good picture painted at Paris, a miniature copied from it would make me the happiest of beings, and next to that, a lock of your own dear gray hair would give me the greatest pleasure." End quote. In February 1780, Shipley received this snuff box painted with Franklin's image and a lock of his hair. On receiving the gifts, Shipley wrote a thank you note and expressed her reactions to the objects. She wrote that at the sight of the, quote, "beloved little lock of hair, my pleasure increased, and I kissed both that and the picture 1,000 times," end quote. The tokens of friendship evoked an embodied emotional response from Shipley in a way that Franklin's actual presence would have. She kissed him, or more specifically, his likeness and hair. Moreover, Shipley explained that the miniature would, quote, "ever be my constant and favorite companion, and not only make me happier, but better as long as I live. I shall be shaped in my character by reflecting on yours," end quote. The miniature, according to Shipley, was a memory object that made Franklin's character present. She expected that engaging Franklin's character, present in the image and hair, would transform her own character. These memory objects made the absent Franklin physically present and enlivened the belief of him, such that Shipley experienced him as if he were in the room. This was not a disembodied contemplation of a friend. This was an embodied sense experience with memory objects that made an absent friend really present. The Enlightenment transformed the ways people perceived objects to work with, on, and as memories. People in colonial America preserved memories of their living family and friends by collecting their likenesses and locks of hair. They no longer saw objects as barriers to remembering because the Enlightenment centered objects in the memory and upheld objects as memories. People use objects as memory devices to experience absent loved ones through sight and touch. The Enlightenment enlivened memory, such that viewing or touching objects associated with absent people made those people really present. Memory objects were no longer dead objects that just signified the past. They now made the past present, alive, tangible, and active. Evangelical Protestants adopted these enlightened memory practices to bring real presence back to memory objects of the dead. In early America, Protestants engaged dying bodies and corpses and other relics as lively memory objects. On their preaching tours in the American colonies, George Whitefield and John and Charles Wesley, all evangelical Protestant ministers in the Church of England, taught people how to inspect corpses for supernatural signs of salvation in their mourning practices as they remembered the dead. These ministers argued that dying bodies and corpses were physically marked by the Holy Spirit and converted souls on their flights to heaven. They regarded corpses as supernatural memory objects that could be touched and looked at as a way of experiencing souls of the dead, the Holy Spirit, and God. From the 1740s onward, inspecting dying bodies and corpses for evidence of salvation became an important part of the evangelical good death experience. Whitefield and the Wesleys encouraged people to inspect dying bodies and corpses for these supernatural marks in their protracted mourning practices. The ways evangelicals applied Enlightenment epistemologies to corpses as supernatural memory objects that could be experienced by the living brought presence back to bodily relics. Corpses were no longer just dead matter, but living supernatural matter connected to souls and God in heaven that could be experienced through touch and sight by the living for the transformation of their own bodies into godly bodies. Unlike their predecessors, these evangelical ministers also taught people that mourning practices were manly Christian practices. From the 1740s onward, evangelical ministers and lay people started to argue that mourning practices, especially practices like weeping for the dead, inspecting corpses, and keeping relics, were manly practices that connected the living to the dead and brought the living closer to God. Evangelicals, unlike other Protestants before them, upheld crying in mourning and engaging with bodily and contact relics as manly Christian devotions. In fact, when George Whitefield died in Newburyport, Massachusetts on September 30th, 1770, colonial Americans engaged in all these mourning practices for him as manly Christian devotions. Whitefield died while on his seventh preaching tour in the American colonies at the home of the Reverend Jonathan Parsons. Whitefield had just preached in Exeter and was supposed to preach in Newburyport at the Old South Church. When Whitefield died, the news spread to neighboring towns, and thousands of evangelicals traveled to Newburyport to inspect his corpse. In fact, Whitefield had told some people on his preaching tours that he wanted them to inspect his corpse and sing this hymn over his corpse. Printers issued this hymn as a broadside titled, "A Hymn Composed by the Reverend Mr. Whitefield to be Sung Over His Own Corpse." Now, this hymn was not actually composed by Whitefield, it was composed by the Wesleys, but most colonial Americans thought it was actually composed by Whitefield because they had heard him talk about corpse inspection so much. This broadside included an image of Whitefield's corpse to make the act of singing over the corpse possible for those who could not see it in person. The hymn actually described the practice of corpse inspection. The first two stanzas extolled the beauty of surveying Whitefield's relics. And they said this: "Ah, lovely appearance of death! No sight upon earth is so fair, not all the gay pageants that breathe can with a dead body compare. With solemn delight I survey the corpse when the spirit is fled, in love with the beautiful clay, and longing to lay in its stead. How blessed is our brother bereft of all that could burden his mind." These stanzas suggested that Whitfield's relics were a beautiful sight, which mourners should inspect to perceive his soul's flight to God in heaven. Other stanzas argued that gazing on Whitfield's corpse would help observers induce conversion experiences or lead them closer to God. The image made inspecting and singing over Whitfield's corpse possible for evangelical mourners unable to attend his deathbed, funeral, or place of burial in Newburyport. Funeral sermons for Whitfield even described how people who had seen him preach in Exeter had seen the glories of heaven on his dying body. On Sunday afternoon, just hours after Whitfield's death, Jonathan Parsons preached a funeral sermon at his house. He took Philippians 1:21 as his text, which reads, "For me to live is Christ, and to die is gain." Death was a gain, the minister said, because, like Paul, Whitfield now experienced the quote, blessings of salvation, which are reserved in heaven for the servants of Christ, end quote. While Paul and Whitfield experienced the full glories of heaven after death, Parsons explained that all evangelicals could glimpse the glories of heaven while still alive. He explained, quote, Christianity may and Christians may in this life have the full assurance of hope, which will never turn to their confusion or disappointment, end quote. This assurance of salvation in heaven did not depend on good works, but, quote, the free grace of God in Christ, which abundantly fills their souls with its lovely manifestations and distinguishing fruits, end quote. Parsons described the assurance of salvation as the material manifestations of the Holy Spirit in converts' bodies. With these, he explained, Christians, quote, may have some foretastes of heaven, some glimpses of glory, which produce these holy transports that are better felt than experienced. According to Parsons, converted Christians like Whitfield and Paul could feel heaven through embodied supernatural sense experiences with the Holy Spirit while they were still living on earth. In his funeral sermon, Parsons explained that Whitfield did experience these foretastes of heaven just before his death. During his final sermon in Exeter, Parsons reminded his listeners, Whitfield, quote, hoped it was the last time he should ever preach. Doubtless he then had such clear views of the blessedness of open vision and the complete fruition of God in Christ that he felt the pleasures of heaven in his raptured soul, which made his countenance, his face, shine like the unclouded sun, end quote. It is tempting to interpret Parsons' words as metaphorical, but we should not. Parsons was describing an embodied supernatural sense experience of heaven that converted Christians like Paul and Whitfield could have while still alive near death. They could see heaven by feeling it in their bodies. Parsons also preached that Whitfield's felt experience of heaven could be observed on his shining face. He said attendees at Whitfield's last sermon had witnessed his felt experience of heaven by seeing it on his face near death. In another funeral sermon in Newburyport, the Reverend Jedediah Jewett explained why mourning for Whitfield was a manly Christian practice. Jewett addressed his sermon foremost to the men and brethren of the congregation and explained this lesson about mourning. He said, quote, we may recollect that Jesus Christ, while he tabernacled in the flesh, and when he was going to the grave of his dear friend Lazarus, with his sisters and a train of other mourners, expressed the tender sentiments of his heart by his groans and tears, end quote. Jewett referenced an episode in the Gospel of John when Jesus mourned for his friend. The minister explained just how Jesus mourned. He said Jesus, quote, groaned in the spirit and was troubled, or according to the original language, he troubled or afflicted himself. He gave the reins in some measure to his grief. Jesus wept, end quote. Jewett concluded, quote, well then may we weep and afflict ourselves, give scope to the sorrowful affections of our hearts, because our friend and the friend of Christ sleepeth, end quote. This evangelical minister authorized mourners, foremost men, to weep for their Christian friend, Whitfield, like Jesus wept for his friend, Lazarus. Jewett went on to explain that weeping and mourning directed the hearts of evangelicals to the will of God, gave them hope in life after death and the resurrection, helped them lament sin, and induced conversion in the unconverted. Jewett authorized weeping over Whitfield's corpse as a proper Christian and manly practice. In the days and weeks after Whitfield's death, printers published other broadsides with images of his corpse. The Library Company of Philadelphia has one of these. It is a broadside with an elegy for Whitfield by Phyllis Wheatley, the famous evangelical poet who was enslaved in Boston and heard Whitfield preach. In her poem, Wheatley explained that Boston evangelicals, quote, mourned that tomb obscurely placed, end quote. Boston evangelicals were upset over Whitfield's place of burial in Newburyport because they considered him, in life and death, to be God's liaison in their fight for equal representation in the British government. In fact, Boston evangelicals had traveled to Newburyport the day after Whitfield's death to take his corpse back to Boston so they could bury it near their church. Parsons would not let Boston evangelicals remove the corpse. Images of Whitfield's corpse, like the one on this broadside, made the practice of corpse inspection possible for those who could not travel to Newburyport to view Whitfield's bodily relics. Other broadsides included the image of Whitfield's corpse with a copy of his will. Americans who read Whitfield's will learned that he gifted mourning rings as lively memory objects of his dead self to his evangelical friends, including John and Charles Wesley. Most people in colonial America wanted to inspect Whitfield's corpse. In the weeks and years after Whitfield's death, the Old South Church in Newburyport became a Protestant pilgrimage site. Many evangelicals traveled to the church's crypt and opened the coffin to see, touch, and steal pieces of Whitfield's corpse and burial clothes. In 1775, members of the Continental Army actually visited the church and cut pieces of Whitfield's burial clothes to take with them into the first major battle of the American Revolution, the Battle of Quebec. From the 1770s to the 1930s, hundreds of thousands of evangelicals inspected Whitfield's corpse for supernatural signs of salvation, and some took bits of his bones and burial clothes with them. By the late 18th century, these evangelical relic practices seeped into many Protestant mourning traditions in the United States. Whether or not a person identified as an evangelical in terms of a conversion experience, many late 18th century Protestants came to identify weeping and inspecting corpses and keeping relics as central to their Christian mourning practices. Protestant relic practices became intimate parts of mourning traditions in America among the genteel classes, and they merged with the budding marketplace and art world. These evangelical deathways influenced Charles Willson Peale, the famous Philadelphia artist. Peale painted a postmortem portrait of his daughter, Margaret. He later expanded the image to depict his wife weeping over their daughter's corpse. Peale also painted a postmortem image of Rachel with locks of her hair. He also painted this postmortem image of Rachel and their dead baby, Eleanor. When George Washington died in 1799, American Protestants mourned for him in all the ways they mourned for Whitfield and their Protestant family members. While Washington's corpse was laid out downstairs at Mount Vernon, Tobias Lear, his nephew and personal secretary, cut locks of hair from Washington's corpse. Lear noted in his diary, quote, "The body was laid in the coffin, at which time I cut off some of the hair," end quote. This was not unusual. Many Episcopalians and other Virginia Protestants came to identify collecting relics as central to their deathbed and mourning rituals. Like other Protestants, Lear, Mrs. Washington, and other Washington family members also encased hair in mourning jewelry to remember, feel, and mourn the dead Washington. The image on this slide is a mourning ring with Washington's hair that was willed by him to Eleanor Calvert Custis Stewart. The hair is hidden behind the octagonal bloodstone, which is hinged and opens to reveal Washington's hair behind the glass. When Washington died, people who attended his funeral also inspected his corpse. At Washington's funeral at Mount Vernon, Protestant mourners of all denominations inspected his corpse while it was laid out on the portico. As the Columbian Sentinel and Massachusetts Federalist explained to readers, a multitude of mourners arrived to find Washington's, quote, great soul was gone, but his mortal part was there indeed, end quote. Those in attendance looked at the, quote, shrouded corpse in the long and lofty portico where oft the hero walked in all his glory, end quote. Viewing the corpse allowed mourners to inspect Washington's face for signs of his salvation and life after death. The newspaper reported that Washington's, quote, countenance, still composed and serene, seemed to express the dignity of the spirit which lately dwelt in that lifeless form, end quote. The serene expression on his corpse was taken as evidence that Washington received salvation after death, and his soul now lived in heaven with God. Viewing Washington's corpse connected mourners to his soul in heaven. This corpse was regarded as holy matter that had been marked by a godly soul. When this account was printed, it confirmed widespread expectations that Washington was indeed America's Protestant hero whose soul lived in heaven with God. A week after the funeral, Tobias Lear inspected Washington's corpse again. On Wednesday, December 25th, Lear called someone from Alexandria to seal the coffin. Before it was sealed, Lear wrote in his diary that he, quote, took a last look, a last farewell of that face, end quote. To be clear, 11 days after Washington's death, Lear inspected his face again. Lear found that Washington's face, quote, still appeared unaltered, end quote. And Lear said that he beheld, quote, for the last time that face, which shall be seen no more here, but which I hope to meet in heaven, end quote. Lear inspected Washington's corpse and hoped they would meet again in heaven one day. Many American Protestants engaged in similar relic practices for Washington. Young women wrote to Mrs. Washington and requested locks of her husband's hair to encase in mourning jewelry. Other women made quilts that incorporated Washington's deathbed scene and corpse, which they wrapped around their own bodies and their family members' bodies. Some artists painted, engraved, and sold images of Washington's heavenly soul rising to heaven from Mount Vernon. These apotheosis scenes were copied on ceramic jugs and sold and displayed or used in American homes. Some Protestant men in Boston secured a lock of hair from Mrs. Washington and processed it into two of the town's most historically significant churches, where they displayed it and other relics for Washington's Protestant funeral services. Some artists produced images of mourners and an eagle weeping over a monument dedicated to Washington. This print was also advertised as a needlework pattern for young women. Others displayed images of Washington's deathbed scene in their homes. Other Americans commissioned Samuel Falwell, a famous Philadelphia artist, to make mourning jewelry with Washington's hair. After the congressional bill for constructing a mausoleum for Washington's corpse near the United States Capitol building expired in 1801, American Protestants started making pilgrimages to Washington's tomb at Mount Vernon to be in the presence of his corpse and experience his heavenly soul. Some even wanted to sleep in the room where Washington died to glimpse his lingering spirit. In 1806, Josiah Quincy, a United States congressman, later mayor of Boston, and future president of Harvard University, traveled to Mount Vernon, where he stayed in the room where Washington died. Quincy told Bushrod Washington, who had inherited the estate after Mrs. Washington's death, that he hoped, quote, he might be found worthy to behold the glorified spirit of him who was so revered by his countrymen, end quote. Later, Quincy reported to his son that he did see Washington's spirit that night in the room where Washington died. Quincy also reported that he and others visited Washington's tomb where they, quote, touched the receptacle of his remains, end quote, and carried away pieces of the black velvet cloth that encased the coffin. Tearing pieces of the pall, touching the coffin, and engaging Washington's heavenly soul were only a foretaste of the Protestant relic practices that developed around America's father. Throughout the 1800s, Mount Vernon became a pilgrimage site because American Protestants wanted to visit Washington's corpse, experience his heavenly soul, and carry away relics collected from around his tomb. These Protestant relic practices became an important part of young women's education from the 1790s to 1850s. The first women's schools in the United States were schools that offered a broadly Protestant education and trained young women according to the Enlightenment principles of reason and sensibility. Training schoolgirls in sensibility required teaching them, quite literally, how to see, hear, and feel the world to cultivate their God-given moral sense. Embroidered mourning pieces became an important part of this education since mourning and needlework practices encouraged embodied supernatural sense experiences that led people closer to God. Mourning pieces worked as Protestant relics or supernatural memory objects that generated the heavenly presences of the dead. Producing mourning pieces trained young women how to engage the dead through material forms of memory. The pieces preserved the memory of the dead by imaging the buried remains of corpses in graveyards. They included memories of the dead in the form of names, death dates, and ages of the deceased. Some schoolgirls stitched hair cut from the dead into their needlework. They also incorporated memories as words from epitaphs on actual gravestones, obituaries that were printed in newspapers, and as Bible verses. These material memories made corpses present in the images and brought them into homes for devotional practices. Protestants wanted to be in the presence of corpses because they assumed physical remains generated the presences of souls in heaven. Working and displaying mourning pieces allowed schoolgirls and families to experience the heavenly presences of their dead. One of the most famous schools for training young women in the art of mourning embroidery was the Anne Elizabeth and Samuel Falwell School in Philadelphia. One of the pieces made at the Falwell School was worked for Daniel Goodman by his sister around 1803. The epitaph on the monument is copied from Goodman's obituary, which was printed in a Philadelphia newspaper. It reads, quote, died yesterday morning Daniel Goodman, aged 18 years. Such was his confidence in the atoning blood of the blessed Redeemer of mankind that he was enabled to commit his soul into his divine charge in hope of a joyful resurrection. So pious an exit must be a great consolation to his bereaved mother, brothers, and sisters, who in him have lost a most dutiful son and an affectionate brother. End quote. The epitaph suggested that the mourning figures are Daniel's mother, brothers, and sisters. The image captured them mourning at Daniel's grave in a churchyard. The epitaph also testified to Daniel's conversion experience. He committed his soul to Jesus, experienced a pious exit, and now served in the army of Jesus. Young women at the Falwell School also worked with Samuel and Anne Elizabeth to make mourning pieces for George Washington. And some of these mourning pieces were actually displayed in churches. As embroidered mourning pieces became popular, lower cost renderings flooded the American marketplace. Some schoolgirls made mourning pieces like this one that did not meet the artistic standards of those produced at the Falwell School. Others produced mourning pieces as watercolors. By the 1850s, these other types of mourning pieces were described as bad art because they did not cost as much to produce and did not meet the artistic standards of fancy embroidered mourning pieces. The images that replaced embroidered mourning pieces were memory pieces produced by lithography studios. The popularity of these lithographs suggests that mourning pieces were relegated to attics because they were seen as overly feminine, undesirable handmade art forms in the new culture of the marketplace. It's important to note that mourning itself was not deemed feminine, but the art form of the mourning piece was. As mourning pieces became increasingly popular in women's education, this specific mourning art form became identified with women. As the pieces proliferated and low cost renderings flooded American homes in painted and plain needlework forms, these handmade pieces were deemed bad art forms and bad relics. Embroidered mourning pieces were also considered a feminine art form because of their association with needlework, which had been deemed women's work and was increasingly understood as a vestige of outdated forms of women's education. Mourning pieces were deemed feminine not because the images depicted people in mourning, but because they were strongly associated with women's education and bad handiwork. Protestants concluded that these bad art forms did not work as good relics, like memory pieces or these lithographs, which were bought from the marketplace. In the 1830s, memoirs of evangelical children instructed young people to distribute relics on their deathbeds or collect relics from their friends' deathbeds as part of the good death experience. These memoirs usually included images of dying children distributing their relics on deathbeds. This image shows the deathbed of Anne Elizabeth Pierce gifting her clothes to her mother for her sisters to wear after her death. The book explained that wearing a dead sibling's clothes was a memory practice that could bring the soul of Anne closer to her living siblings. This is another image from a dying child's memoir that shows her gifting a ring to her mother as a memory object, which she instructed her mother to wear. These memoirs also described how children present for deathbeds inspected corpses for supernatural signs of salvation. The people who grew up reading these memoirs about gathering around deathbeds, inspecting corpses, and exchanging relics actually modeled their own practices after what they read. After adult Protestants gathered around deathbeds, they usually wrote deathbed letters as mini memoirs, which narrated deathbed, corpse inspection, and relic practices. Very often, deathbed letters from the 1800s, like this one, even carried relics in the form of locks of hair or rings to distant family members. Deathbed letters were also kept as relics. And deathbed images and memoirs of children provided the precedent for the popularity of postmortem daguerreotypes. These images were Protestant deathbed scenes that aided in the practice of corpse inspection. Protestants also employed relics to make relic compilations for their family members. This is one such relic compilation. If you take a closer look at this, you'll see it's a heart-shaped booklet. And of course, on the inside, left front cover, a lock of hair has been sewn into the cover. If you look behind the hair, you'll notice there's a piece of fabric that has been pasted into this booklet. That piece of fabric is a piece of burial shroud that was cut from a corpse. This relic compilation was made for a sister and given to her family member. The lock of hair and the burial shroud are from the dead husband. Now, this booklet goes on to explain what a person was supposed to do with this relic compilation. The sister wrote that you're supposed to lay this in your Bible. So, Protestants were collecting relics, displaying them in their homes, and they were also putting relics into their Bibles. Family Bibles became repositories of family memories and places where families collected relics. So, family Bibles often included images of dead people, postmortem photographs, locks of hair, pieces of burial shrouds, and pieces of twigs, sticks, and flowers that people had collected from the tombs of their loved ones. Now, the last example of a Protestant relic I'm going to talk about is an example of a relic kept in a family Bible in the Library Company of Philadelphia's collections. This relic is in the Cogdell Sanders Venning collection. This relic once belonged to Sarah Martha Sanders. In 1830, Sanders was enslaved as a teenager by Richard Cogdell. Although married, Cogdell engaged in a sexual relationship with Sanders when she was about 16 years old. In the 1830s, even if Sanders wanted to refuse Cogdell, no South Carolina law would have supported her choice. Before Sanders gave birth to their first child in 1832, Cogdell's wife left him. Over the course of 18 years, Sanders gave birth to 10 children fathered by Cogdell. The children took their mother's last name and were legally enslaved because she was enslaved. South Carolina laws prevented white men from emancipating the people they enslaved, even if those people were their companions and children. Despite Charleston's anti-black education laws, Cogdell and Sanders hired tutors and educated their surviving children in schools for free people of color. In 1850, Sanders died giving birth to her 10th child when she was just 35 years old. Soon after, Cogdell bought a house in Philadelphia and moved their surviving children there. When Sarah Sanders died in 1850, her children kept this published circular she had owned as a Protestant relic. On the back of this circular, Robert Sanders, her eldest child, wrote this note, quote, "Do not remove this letter from this book, as it was the property of my mother, Robert Sanders." End quote. Like other Protestant relics, this one was kept in a family Bible, where the Sanders children recorded the birth and death dates of their mother, siblings, and extended family members. This relic, however, was an especially important piece of property. Robert referred to this letter as the property of my mother for a reason. It was a letter she owned. When Sanders lived in South Carolina, laws prevented enslaved people from legally learning to read and write. Laws also prevented enslaved people from owning property. This letter offered evidence that Sanders owned property and could read. It preserved the memory of an educated Christian mother who enacted her own freedom despite laws that tried to curtail her freedoms. This letter was an especially powerful relic because in life, Sanders had employed it as a supernatural religious object to protect her family. The circular was titled A Letter of Jesus Christ. The document explained that the original letter had been written by Jesus and found under a stone at the foot of the cross. The letter was supposedly a printed copy of the words of Jesus. The document also included a list of commandments from Jesus, a letter from King Agabus to Jesus, Jesus' response to the king, and a description of cures and miracles worked by Jesus. Today, scholars would describe this letter as an apocryphal Christian text, meaning it was written after the death of Jesus and probably not the historical words of Jesus. For Sanders, however, the document worked as a supernatural religious object of protection because it contained Jesus' words. In the document, Jesus instructed that, quote, "Whosoever shall have a copy of this letter in their houses, nothing shall hurt them." Neither pestilence, lightning, nor thunder shall do them any harm. End quote. This relic was a talisman. Through Jesus' words, the letter was meant to protect the household who kept it. For Sanders, the letter worked as an assurance that Jesus would protect her and her children who balanced precarious lives as legally enslaved but virtually free people. This letter probably appealed to Sanders in particular because it provided protection for pregnant women. It read, quote, "And if a woman be with child and in travail, and a copy of this letter be found about her, and she firmly puts her trust in me, Jesus, she shall be safely delivered." End quote. For a woman who suffered the deaths of three young children and was pregnant, nursing, and caring for children over half of her short life, this letter offered security and protection from Jesus for Sanders and her children. The Sanders children treasured this letter as a relic, a talisman, and the inherited property of their Protestant mother, who had protected, loved, and educated them. As a Protestant relic, the letter helped the adult Sanders children maintain material memory relationships with their mother's soul beyond her grave in Charleston. It brought her presence and Jesus' protection to Philadelphia. The precious relic of a devoted Black mother offered a supernatural pathway to salvation and liberation in this life and the next for her children and future descendants. In Philadelphia, the Sanders children and their descendants treasured this relic and kept it in their family Bible. While these Protestant relic practices were pervasive among most Americans, they have all but been forgotten today. Most Americans do not consider the objects of the Protestant dead to be lively memory objects. Most Americans today consider these objects to be truly dead matter that only help us think immaterial thoughts about once living people. Thank you all. And we can take questions, I think, now if
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, Jamie. That was great. And I can't tell you, I'm ending with a relic from the Stephen Cogdell Sanders Benning collection. I'm still in contact with descendants of that family, so I really appreciated you talking about that piece and thinking about Sarah Sanders, who we don't have a portrait of. And I don't know why you could still visualize or try to understand a person even without seeing their face, so to speak. So to hear about that object and thinking about it protecting her and her children all those many years ago, thank you for ending on that note. I really appreciate it. Not that you were doing it personally for me, but I appreciate it. So there is some time for questions. I'll give some folks to time to get their thoughts together. But I did have a couple questions for you, Jamie, and one that I had was sort of like an aha moment. When or what was your aha moment that relics served as supernatural memory objects for most denominations of the Protestant religion?
I think probably so I started researching the Whitfield chapter first. And that chapter is pretty easy to understand because these people are clearly evangelicals. They're talking about the supernatural. People are writing in their diaries and in newspapers about touching his corpse. But the real aha moment, I think, came when I started studying George Washington's relics because these practices seem so foreign to us today, even though the legacy of Washington and Mount Vernon are still wrapped up in these practices. But to see people actually talk about trying to visit or experience the soul of George Washington, that was really an aha moment because we do not think about George Washington in the ways that these people were describing him and his spirit and his relics. So
Mhm.
even just going to Mount Vernon and realizing that Mount Vernon exists because people went to visit George Washington's gravesite. That was just a really strange moment, I think,
Mhm.
yeah.
Yeah. And I can't help but I'm trying to think like when you were a fellow, if this discussion came up, and I'm sure other people, but thinking about George Washington and all of his pieces of hair that are relevant, for and people sending letters to Martha, can I have something like, so where was all this, like, was he just like all of his hair was but like we know that people are going to be asking for a piece of hair, so let's have a nice ready supply, because I assume they're not keeping going back to the corpse of George Washington to get his hair. So just if you could just talk a little bit, and I'm sure some of the thoughts too, like, is this really George Washington's hair? Is this really parts of the bodies of these people that it is? Is it really Whitfield's thumb bone? And I guess maybe part of like your research and work, thinking about these provenances, what were you doing to be like, yes, I think this really did come from so and so, or there's some suspicion there.
Yeah, so I would say hair circulated when Washington was alive and when he was dead because people used hair of the living as objects of friendship. So even when Washington was alive, people were exchanging locks of hair. There's stories about Washington's barber actually selling his hair in like a hair black market. So I think one way to understand this is that hair worked in very different ways than it might work for modern people. And many people then were just comfortable with the circulation of hair of living people, but also dead people in ways we're not. Another way to think about is this really hair or not is not to think about the authenticity of the hair as true or false, but to
Mhm,
think about the authenticity in terms of circulation. Right,
mhm,
so very often locks of hair circulated with deathbed letters. And actually, if you go into museums and archives and libraries, they're just collections of deathbed letters because the letters were preserved by families.
mhm,
Now, sometimes today the hair has been taken apart from these letters, or family members have pulled the hair out to put it in mourning jewelry. But if we think about authenticity not as true or false, but authenticity as a part of the circulation of deathbed letters, then that
mhm,
can help us see how powerful these things were for people. They are actually collecting these locks around deathbeds or at funerals or while people are laid out. Now, of course, people had concerns about this, especially when hair workers emerged as professionals in the 1800s. People are quite concerned whether or not they should be sending locks of hair of their dead loved ones to
mhm,
professional artists through the mail because
mhm,
there's a concern that they may be getting back a fake relic.
mhm,
So there is some concern about giving locks of hair to professional artists and the fear
mhm.
that the real thing might not come back.
Oh,
Yeah.
that's interesting. I do have a question for you. Um, the use of hair in mourning jewelry is most commonly associated with Victorian mourning practices. Do you know if the way people interacted with these objects in the Victorian period similar or different from the spiritual relic mode you discussed from from this earlier period?
Yeah, this is a really good question. And I would say the way we describe the Victorian era in the United States is actually like a misuse of the term. And here's why, is because in England, there's a Victorian era because of Queen Victoria. Americans didn't have a Victorian period. Now, the reason that hair was popular in the United States and in England is because of evangelical relic practices. Evangelicalism was a transatlantic movement between the American colonies and England, and then eventually the United States. So, what we tend to think of Victorian hair work and mourning practices is really a misnomer and it's been mislabeled. These are actually evangelical practices. They get associated with the Victorian period because we have evidence of these practices in England. But Americans are not identifying themselves as Victorians in the sense that they belong to English history. Does that help
Mhm.
answer that question? Um, so even for Americans to describe themselves as Victorians, they weren't doing that. That's a thing that modern people have overlaid into the past.
Mhm. No,
Yes.
oh no, that's a great answer. Thank you. Um, just in putting kind of my visual culture program hat on, I was just curious about the cover image you chose for your book, and I know you showed it during your presentation. And I was just curious as to why you chose that image. I can imagine why, but I'm just curious as
Yeah,
to why.
I chose that image because it's actually this multi-layered relic. So the practice that that image shows is visiting a corpse in a graveyard. So it's a person visiting a bodily relic, right? So the corpse is there, you just can't see it. It's buried in the ground. The second reason I chose that is because a mourning piece, right? This is a memory piece, one of those lithographs. These would have been relics for people after the period of mourning embroideries, right? So these lithographs would have been inscribed with personal memories of the dead, although this one isn't. It doesn't have writing on it. But that act of writing would have made these kind of images relics themselves.
Mhm.
Now, the third reason that this image is a relic is because if you actually look at what the woman is doing in
Yeah.
that image, she has a relic. She's wearing a relic of her dead loved one. So she's
Mhm.
wearing an image of the dead loved one
Mhm.
at the grave site, and she's
Mhm.
touching, right? So she's actually touching that. And one of the things that I argue in my book is that people are actually touching relics to induce these experiences with
Mhm.
relics. So we have evidence of this from letters where people talk about touching, but also some other images where touch becomes a way to kind of activate these memory objects. So that image, I love it because it's this really multi-layered relic, and we don't always think about images as pointing to practices,
Mhm.
images as an object itself, but then the
Mhm.
image is also pointing to the touch of a relic.
Yeah. And just I'm going a little tangential here, but I was just thinking, in terms of you talking about mourning as masculine, even though still being associated with feminine and talking is thinking of the views, some of the images you show where it's like the men weeping and not necessarily the women. Or I know you didn't show it, but there's a view by William Birch of Washington's funeral procession, and I think it is a man for the most part who is shown. I could be misremembering, but it's making me think that to look at these images in a different way, and also just what you were talking about, like feeling the brooch or the memory object on her chest. And I think something that you were talking about in your conclusion or little note I wrote down is sort of like, the belief versus the feeling of memory object as a lie. So it's not only necessarily the tangible feeling, but that, feeling, the less tangible feeling, and how it's similar or different from believing that an object is alive. And I think that's a very interesting point that you bring out in your work. So we're coming at the close of the hour. Thank you so much, Jamie. This was such an interesting talk, and our discussion. Really appreciate you answering our questions. I hope folks will go out and buy your book. As Jamie had, there's a discount that you can use that code. But this was a wonderful Thursday evening. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, everyone. I hope you have a good night. And I know a holiday's coming up for some folks, so please, I hope you enjoy the holiday coming up. Thanks again. All right, everyone, have a good evening.